For more, we're joined from Canberra by John Blaxland, head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU's College of Asia and the Pacific. John Blaxland, good to talk to you tonight. What do you make
Karina.
of the timing of these warships entering Sydney Harbour?
Look, I think we need to be fairly sanguine about this. The bottom line is that, as the Prime Minister said, this is something that was a reciprocal arrangement. These things are planned well in advance, and they're actions that are taken on a reciprocal basis. Australia accesses Chinese ports, China gains access to Australian ones. But it's interesting to note that this probably happened, China was planning for this in anticipation of a different election outcome. And had there been a Labor Party victory, this might have been an opportunity for China to kind of present a clean slate, if you like, start afresh, open up a new dialogue with the Australian government about China's having a friendlier face in the neighbourhood. But of course, that didn't happen, and the ramifications are that China has not had that message. In fact, the opposite message came out of Beijing shortly after it became clear that Scott Morrison was going to win the election. The Chinese came out in a pretty forthright critique of Australia, particularly over the Huawei decision and the issue of 5G telecommunications, and also about Australia's approach to China and its policy in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So it's not surprising, really, that China should want to be quiet about this visit, in part because the message that I think they were probably going to try and push when they came hasn't eventuated, hasn't materialised, but also there's probably concerns about the issue of potential protests against the ship's visit, particularly given that we're on the cusp of the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. And of course, that's a pretty odious event, one that even just the other day in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Defence Minister General Wei was saying that it was completely defensible and appropriate. And that's kind of thinking, people are thinking, well, really, was that necessary? Did he need to say that? I mean, surely he could have just, played with a straight bat and diffused that. But no, there was a doubling down on it. So, in terms of the relationship, yes, a ship visit is welcome, but, it's not quite as friendly as perhaps it could have been, or perhaps as China would have liked it to have been. Australia is just not prepared at this stage, under this government, to change its tune.
Nonetheless, John, it's certainly perceived secrecy around the visit. You've explained why China may wanted to have kept it under wraps. Why the Australian government, though? Is that to that idea you're saying about to minimise the chance of protests? Oh,
look, to be fair, these things usually don't get big public announcements. You get visits coming in, and partly that's because of operational security concerns. Not only do you have concerns that China might have about protests, and there's a reciprocal obligation there to respect that. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be respected every time Australia goes up north, shall we say, but certainly Australia feels the obligation to, if they ask for discretion, that we offer that discretion. And I mean, all the authorities, all the people who needed to know in terms of port authorities, government authorities, defence infrastructure, they were all primed, of course, necessarily so. But in terms of alerting the media, well, it's interesting to think about how much of this is a reaction to commentary, how much of this is a reaction to reality. There's a lot of speculation people have made about this. I think we need to be fairly level-headed about what is a pretty routine and, mutually respectful arrangement.
Part of that speculation centres around the route that China has taken. It was carrying out a drug trafficking operation in the Middle East. Sydney would not seem to be a natural port on the way back to China from the Middle East.
Well, look, it's very interesting, Karina, you're right, because the Pacific Reset is now featuring very much in China's consciousness. What the Australian Prime Minister has just been doing in the Solomon Islands resonates with China. China has been watching the Pacific Reset for some time now and has been a little bit uncomfortable, I think, with how that's shaping up, simply because it's a bit of a confrontation. It's a bit of a challenge to China about whose space this is we're talking about. And of course, historically, this has been a space that Australia has felt very comfortable with. Now, it's interesting. I'm a historian by training, and I think it's worth reflecting a little bit on the history of the circumstances, because when you think about our engagement with Papua New Guinea at Federation, Papua New Guinea, or the British part of Papua New Guinea was handed to Australia a little bit before that to manage, particularly through Queensland, to manage, and then by the Federation to manage as something that the Brits handed over to us. Now, we didn't want that for other British territories in the Pacific, Fiji, New Hebrides and so on. But what we found is as Britain retreated, we were left as the kind of the English-speaking cousin, if you like, of the neighbourhood, to which those countries looked for education, for social ties, for connections, and it was a natural connection to make, along with New Zealand, of course, Australia and New Zealand in that same boat. So while Australia has never actually looked at some of those micro-states in the Pacific as their territory, there's a long parallel connection through the old British Empire that means that they speak English, their rules and customs, apart from the traditional original ones, British transplanted ones. There's a commonality with Australia that leads to a natural connectivity between us, which the Prime Minister is now doubling down on. And of course, and you look around the neighbourhood and you look at what the people in Fiji might think, or in Solomon Islands might think, and various other parts of the Pacific with connections to the old British Empire. You know, they speak English. They're invested in us, in the ties with a country like Australia. And so it's actually pretty easy for the Prime Minister to kind of piggyback off that and to leverage the connections we've established ourselves over the years, but going back to World War II and before, but particularly subsequent to World War II, and refresh that. But it's from a low start. I mean, we haven't been doing this very well, Katrina. We really haven't. We kind of dropped the ball a bit on the Pacific. We're picking it up a little bit.
So, John, sorry, let me interrupt there then.
Yeah.
In context of that Pacific reset that you talk about from China then, how would you characterise Scott Morrison's commitment to Solomon Islands, where he's been for the last couple of days?
Oh, very interesting.
Do you think he's playing it safe?
Look, I think he's playing it pretty sensibly. The bottom line is that there's no point painting this in terms of great power contestation alone. The thing is that what we're facing at the moment in the Pacific is a confluence of three major factors. Great power contestation is clearly a factor, but so is environmental catastrophe, imminent environmental disaster, which these micro-states that are only just above the sea level feel very, very palpably, okay? So there's great power contestation, there's environmental catastrophe imminent, it appears, and the issue of governance. And here we're talking about the dark web, we're talking about crime gangs, we're talking about challenges to governance in these micro-states. Now, when you put those three factors together, you pull together kind of the perfect organisational political storm into which the Pacific reset is engaged. And as I say, rhetorically, it's looked like a bit of an anti-China effort, but I think from Australia's point of view, in terms of Australia's national interests writ large, it's really the confluence of those three dimensions: great power contestation, environmental challenges, and governance concerns combined make this Pacific reset really important, and arguably not enough. We need to actually double down on this idea of a Pacific reset, offering our neighbours considerably more than we're offering. And I think that's where I think there's scope for us to think about what New Zealand's done for the Cook Islands, or what the United States has done for the Federated States of Micronesia. We really need to engage in a whole new way in the Pacific. The Prime Minister's trying. There's more work to be done.
John Blaxland, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.